During the mid-2000s, the first-person shooter space was experiencing something of a golden age on the PC. After a decade of rapid evolution, the genre was the most creatively and technically effervescent it had ever been. Blockbuster sequels like Half-Life 2 and Doom 3 were pushing the limits of their field in ways that had never been attempted in the past, while strong original titles like Call of Duty and Far Cry were sowing the seeds of what would become monumental franchises in the future. It's within this bubble that Monolith Productions would debut F.E.A.R, a supernatural-themed first-person shooter inspired by the cinematic works of Hideo Nakata and John Woo. F.E.A.R distinguished itself from its competitors with its sophisticated enemy AI and J-horror-inspired narrative, which sees the player contend with a monstrous psychic entity known as Alma Wade. While it never became as synonymous with its genre as Valve or id Software's most renowned works, players lapped it up all the same. And over the next few years, ports, expansions, and sequels of Monolith's opus would grace PCs and home consoles alike. Yet the more the frightful saga progressed, the more it would move away from what had made its inaugural title so potent. Its follow-ups were still entertaining and occasionally quite creative, but the intelligence of their enemies and the scariness of their locales only seemed to become more muted. Like so many other series during the 7th console generation, F.E.A.R found itself unable to escape the gravitational pull of its era's most popular shooters, resulting in its identity being gradually stripped away as it attempted to remake itself further and further in their image. Over the decade of its existence, the F.E.A.R series epitomized the era in which it debuted and the era it became part of, with everything good and bad that this entailed. This is the rise and fall of F.E.A.R. Like many young PC developers in the 90s, Monolith Productions' first wave of games were eclectic in both tone and style. From Blood, a grisly first-person shooter centered on the occult, to Claw, a chirpy pirate-themed platformer, the Washington-based studio made no buts about dabbling in as many genres as it could following its founding in 1994, attracting a respectable following in the process. However, after releasing Blood 2: The Chosen, and the mecha-inspired shooter Shogo to poor sales in 1998, Monolith fell on hard times, and some soul-searching was in order. It's during this period that the studio became interested in making a first-person shooter that would provide a Hollywood-like experience, wherein the player would feel like an action movie hero. It wasn't a particularly novel idea. Many other shooters during this era featured largely similar premises. But the studio felt that with its pedigree, it could spin it in a way that none of its contemporaries had previously thought of. Determined to both reclaim the trust of their fan base and overcome the failures of their previous two titles, Monolith's staff moved ahead with this concept, and after a multitude of iterations, their action movie ambitions would coalesce into the operative No One Lives Forever, a stealth-heavy first-person shooter with a 1960s spy film aesthetic. Stylish, bombastic, and sporting a lovingly witty protagonist, No One Lives Forever would release in the year 2000 to widespread critical and commercial acclaim. Critics hailed it as being among the best titles in its genre, and Monolith found itself able to rest easy once more. The studio would attempt to make the most of their spy thriller's popularity over the next few years, releasing a sequel subtitled A Spy in Harm's Way, and a spin-off called Contract Jack in 2002 and 2003 respectively. It would also begin applying its knack for developing shooters to popular licensed properties, creating Aliens vs. Predator 2 and Tron 2.0 within this same period. With the exception of Contract Jack, all of these titles would go on to be favorably received, cementing Monolith's reputation as a developer of considerable caliber and ensuring that it would keep on trucking ahead. But it wasn't ready to rest on its laurels. After spending a half-decade working within No One Lives Forever's thematic and visual confines, Monolith had become anxious to take the original core concept that had led to its creation a first-person shooter that would provide an action movie-like experience and reinterpret it in an entirely new way. It wanted to push the technical capabilities of the medium forward and catch players off guard in ways that none of their previous games had been able to. And they would do so by taking inspiration from a medium no one could have predicted. At the end of the 21st century, Japanese horror films had experienced a massive renaissance. After spending decades relying on more schlocky and exploitative depictions of the macabre, the genre had been swept up by a new, more refined breed of movies, ones that placed much greater emphasis on slow-creeping suspense and psychological terror than unbridled gore. Chief amongst this new breed was Hideo Nakata's 1998 classic, Ring. The most popular film of its genre during this era, Ring centered on a cursed videotape that allowed Sadako, a vengeful Yurei or spirit, to enter and wreak havoc on the world of the living. Both this film and several others, including Takashi Shimizu's Ju-On franchise, would eventually find themselves remade in the United States over the course of the next decade, with many American studios trying, and often failing, to capitalize on their popularity and uniqueness. But even before this would begin to occur, the original versions of these films had managed to captivate people all over the globe, including Craig Hubbard, who had served as No One Lives Forever's chief game designer and was now directing Monolith's new action movie-like experience. Hubbard and the rest of Monolith knew that in the same way No One Lives Forever's 60s spy aesthetic helped save it from feeling like another generic shooter, imbuing this new project with elements of J-horror would give it an extremely distinct identity. It wouldn't be the first shooter to prominently feature horror elements, but it would be the first to feature such a distinctly East Asian spin on them. And because Hubbard was already extremely familiar with the subject matter in question, he and the rest of the team would be able to create it with greater confidence and passion than any of their past endeavors. This was all in addition to another cinematic that Monolith's staff wanted to imbue the project with: Hong Kong action movies. The over-the-top intensity of films like John Woo's Hard Boiled had left an impression on the team, one that they felt had not been replicated by any other game before. If they could successfully translate these movies' manic brand of action into the way the player fought, it would set the project even further apart from its competition, as well as potentially complement its moments of J-horror elements. After about a year of development, these various influences would coalesce into F.E.A.R. First Encounter Assault Recon, a first-person shooter in which the player, an anonymous point man with the ability to slow down time, as well as perform various martial arts-inspired melee attacks, is tasked with bringing down two powerful beings that have taken over the headquarters of the mysterious Armacam Technology Corporation. Paxton Fettel, a rogue psychic who has taken control of an army of clone super soldiers, and Alma, a terror-inducing entity that disguises her true form with that of a young girl. All of these aspects, as well as the fact that it was a Monolith-developed game, would be enough to get audiences extremely hyped for F.E.A.R. following its public reveal at the 2004 Electronic Entertainment Expo. Yet F.E.A.R. contained one more aspect that would go on to be extensively detailed in the months that followed, and would bolster its appeal even further. Monolith understood that in order to make the player's time-slowing abilities and martial arts moves feel like necessary and balanced parts of the game, it would need to feature enemies that would put them through the ringer. And in order to create enemies that would be intelligent enough to do so, it would be imbuing them with a new artificial intelligence system called Goal-Oriented Action Programming, or GOAP. The brainchild of Monolith's Peter Higley, GOAP would enable F.E.A.R.'s enemies to act with a level of complexity unseen in most prior first-person shooters. In those games, enemies would typically only move between select nodes or areas, and make decisions on what to do in a highly scripted fashion, their programming only allowing them to activate a new goal, like move to an area or start shooting, if the player did something in the right place and at the right time first. They could still behave in ways that appeared intelligent, but there would always be a layer of predictability underlying whatever they did, waiting to be exploited. In contrast, F.E.A.R.'s enemies would be able to navigate themselves to almost any point within their environment, be able to choose what goals they want to achieve on their own, and decide in real time what steps they needed to take in order to satisfy these goals. On a practical level, this meant that the enemies would act in a much more dynamic and intelligent fashion than non-GOP AI. If one of them got killed, the rest of them would deliberately avoid the spot in which this happened. If the player attempted to block them from entering through a door with their body, they would attempt to dive through a nearby window. And if they saw an opportunity to do so, they would try to flank the player from whatever angle they could. In order to make sure this intelligence would be apparent to the player, Monolith would go out of its way to record an exorbitant amount of lines for the game's enemies, providing them with dialogue for almost every possible situation they could find themselves in. The last thing that the studio wanted was for players to pick up the game at launch and find out that one of their game's most important elements hadn't hit home with players in the way they wanted it to.
Flashlight!
When F.E.A.R would finally release in October of 2005, this wild array of ideas and systems would prove a very strong experience, with critics quickly hailing it one of the best shooters of the year. Its combat encounters were tremendously satisfying, both in terms of the breadth of abilities and weapons one was encouraged to use within them, and the demandingness of the enemies they contained. Yet they managed to be satisfying without diluting the game's sense of scariness, which only became sharper the further the Point Man's journey progressed. True to Monolith's vision, the game felt as if the works of John Woo and Hideo Nakata had been condensed down into a single experience, one in which both existed in perfect harmony, rather than at odds with each other. And while the story that wove through this experience wasn't the most coherent to ever be put to polycarbonate, it wasn't without its merits. Not only did it use some clever narrative devices to flesh out its world, such as integrating most of its lore into voicemails left on answering machines, but it was also bookended by a spectacular conclusion, with the game's final hours seeing the Point Man kill Paxton Fettel after it's revealed that they were both birthed by Alma Wade. In spite of all this, one area where players almost unanimously conceded that the game could have done better was its environments. Outside of the few moments in which Alma dragged players into the Almaverse, a dreamlike reality created by her psychic influence, most of the game's environments were drab and repetitive, consisting of the same generic office complex, seemingly copy and pasted ad nauseum. In an interview with IGN in 2009, Monolith's Leo DeBruyne would attribute the sameness of its environments to time and budget constraints, as well as the team trying a tad too hard to ensure that the game looked consistently creepy. While there was little debate that they succeeded in doing so, he would acknowledge that a break here and there could have helped it feel less fatiguing. Not as disliked, but also not incredibly beloved either, would be F.E.A.R's multiplayer. Because the game was a new property, Monolith had elected early on to keep its multiplayer offering simple, with Hubbard explaining in a 2005 interview with GameSpot that they wanted to start with a solid foundation and build upwards, rather than jump right into something fancy. For this reason, all it featured were some standard multiplayer game types, like Deathmatch and Capture the Flag, with a few extra wrinkles from the game's single-player campaign mixed in, such as its slow motion abilities. None of it felt bad or tacked on. It just didn't particularly stand out when compared to what the rest of the package offered. While these deficits would arguably prevent F.E.A.R from becoming as renowned as the likes of Half-Life or Doom, they wouldn't stop it from becoming Monolith's best-selling title yet, as well as becoming a source of influence for the design of many more games to come. From Stalker, Shadow of Chernobyl, to Crystal Dynamics' Tomb Raider reboot, F.E.A.R's GOP system would find its way into many other titles in the decade following its release, extending its indigenous game's legacy well beyond that of most other shooters. Unfortunately, before Monolith would be able to bask in the glory of this long-term accomplishment, it would be forced to deal with some short-term shenanigans. About a year before F.E.A.R's release, Monolith had allowed itself to be purchased by Warner Brothers. The two entities had previously possessed a fairly intimate relationship. Both had collaborated together on the development of The Matrix Online over the past several years. And Jason Hall, who had previously helped co-found Monolith and served as its CEO for a long period, had joined Warner Brothers Interactive Entertainment as its first senior vice president just 7 months prior to the acquisition. Their union seemed practically kismet, and for the most part, didn't affect the progress of any of the other projects that Monolith was working on at the time. However, as a result of various contracts that Monolith had negotiated before this purchase, Vivendi, not Warner Brothers, ended up retaining the rights to F.E.A.R's name after its release the following year. This alone was bothersome to Monolith, but what was even more so was that due to a falling out that had occurred between the two, Vivendi planned on continuing to use said rights without the studio's involvement. The F.E.A.R series was now under the ownership of two dueling entities, one with access to the story, characters, and many other conceits unique to it, and the other with access to its branding. Monolith would vow early on that even though this meant it could no longer release any more games with F.E.A.R in its title, it would continue to develop new games set within the horror universe. Yet the next 2 years would see the burgeoning series continue entirely under other developers, with the exception of F.E.A.R Combat. A free repackaging of F.E.A.R's multiplayer component released in August of 2006, F.E.A.R Combat wouldn't prove immensely popular, but it would still go on to enjoy a loyal fan base over the next few years. So much so that a dedicated group of players within the F.E.A.R community has continued to update and keep it online after GameSpy, which hosted its original master server, discontinued its support of it in 2012. The first few F.E.A.R projects to be made entirely under Vivendi's guidance would arrive in October of 2006, with the release of both an Xbox 360 port of the horror shooter and an expansion titled F.E.A.R Extraction Point. The 360 port's development had been contracted out by Vivendi to Day One Studios, a Chicago-based developer that had gotten its start in the late 90s, making video game adaptations of classic board games like Battleship, as well as Axis and Allies, before coming into its own with the Mech Assault games on the original Xbox. Its work on the port represented the first project the studio had completed since the release of Mech Assault 2: Lone Wolf in 2004. And while it didn't contain everything that had been included in its original release, it did include a few bells and whistles not present in the PC version. Some new guns, an additional single-player mission, and instant action, an original game mode that scored players based on how skillfully they managed to complete a host of combat-intensive scenarios, were now available exclusively for Xbox 360 owners of F.E.A.R to mess around with. These additions wouldn't be enough to prevent critics from lamenting the port's concessions, but they would still manage to bolster its appeal ever so slightly, resulting in it being received almost as well as the original version. Extraction Point, on the other hand, had been developed by Timegate Studios, a Texas-based developer most known for its work on the Kohan real-time strategy games, and its reception would be less unanimously positive. Many felt that its story, which pitted the Point Man against a newly revived Fettel in an escapade set immediately after F.E.A.R's ending, didn't have much to offer, besides providing an unnecessary epilogue to what came before it, as well as introducing too many unanswered questions for whatever sequel Vivendi would eventually create for the expansion. And while it contained new environments, enemies, and weapons to tussle with, such as chain guns and deployable turrets, they ultimately didn't do enough to make it feel like that distinctive an experience when compared to its predecessor. But even though these aspects of Extraction Point weren't that great, it still contained the same mechanics, systems, and aesthetic qualities that had made said predecessor so revered. Experiencing them wasn't as novel as it had been the first time around, especially when they were used to try and scare the player. Yet these elements alone still made for a very satisfying experience. As a result, while Extraction Point would ultimately end up being placed on a lower pedestal than F.E.A.R by critics, it was still enjoyed by many.
He's alive.
Should I call in a medevac?
He doesn't appear to be injured, although I don't know how he survived.
Extraction Point's release would be followed in April of 2007 by F.E.A.R's PlayStation 3 port, developed once again by Day One Studios. Content-wise, the port offered almost exactly what Day One had previously offered in the Xbox 360 version, with its additional mission featuring a slightly different scenario than what the former had offered. Yet its reviews would be less kind, with many critics disparaging the port for looking and feeling significantly worse than its counterparts. Between its inconsistent frame rate, awkward control scheme, and washed-out visuals, the PlayStation 3 version of F.E.A.R was easily the game's worst variant. Though considering how many other developers were struggling during this period to achieve parity between Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3 releases of the same games, it wouldn't be fair to attribute its poorness to Day One alone. The complex architecture of Sony's high-definition console was likely to blame as well. After this, Timegate Studios would round out the year in November with a second expansion to Monolith's horror shooter, F.E.A.R. Perseus Mandate.
Get us out of here, Chapter. Find a better LZ.
Unlike Extraction Point, which had served as a direct continuation of the original F.E.A.R, Perseus Mandate followed an unnamed sergeant on a deathly jaunt parallel to the events of the base game, with him and his team sent in to investigate a similar, yet separate Armacham facility beset by its own supernatural woes, and critics would be none too pleased with it. Outside of a few decent scares, some enjoyable firefights, and a challenging, fearsome new group of enemies called the Nightcrawlers that its campaign featured intermittently, the expansion as a whole felt severely tired compared to what had come before it. Where Extraction Point had at least felt like it made an effort to expand on the first game's narrative and mechanics, Perseus Mandate felt like a rehash of everything that was featured in the original F.E.A.R and Extraction Point, yet without the presence of its most celebrated characters. And the engine supporting all of it, now over 2 years old, was beginning to show its age. An issue exacerbated by the fact that Timegate had attempted to make Perseus Mandate's environments bigger than those of its predecessors. In the same month that Perseus Mandate was made available on the PC, both it and Extraction Point would be packaged together and released on the Xbox 360 as F.E.A.R files. Beyond serving as the expansion's first and only appearance on a home console, F.E.A.R files would also contain a sizable collection of new instant action scenarios, courtesy of Day One Studios. Yet opinions on its main attractions would remain largely the same. Extraction Point was an imperfect, yet still very enjoyable follow-up to Monolith's opus, while Perseus Mandate was only really worthwhile to the most hardcore of F.E.A.R fans. By the end of 2007, the consensus had been reached that it was high time someone made a proper sequel to F.E.A.R, one that would inject the series with new ideas, update its engine, and move past the narrative beats and locations that its expansions had been unable to escape from. Put simply, the world needed F.E.A.R 2. And as it would happen, no less than 3 different versions of F.E.A.R 2 were being worked on around this very time. The first version, as revealed by Ryan Davis on a 2011 episode of the Giant Bombcast, was being worked on by Day One Studios for Vivendi. A continuation of the publisher's take on the F.E.A.R franchise, it ultimately ended up being discontinued, albeit not before some of its fundamental aspects were hammered out. The other 2 were being made at Monolith, with Craig Hubbard revealing in 2013 that the studio was developing one exclusively for home consoles, while the other was being developed exclusively for the PC. Eventually, the PC-exclusive version ended up being nixed after another project within Monolith took precedence, resulting in the console-exclusive version both becoming the sole edition of the sequel in existence and being reworked so that it could arrive on personal computers as well. After watching the property be taken in a direction it had disagreed with for some time, Monolith was anxious to show the world how it wanted the series to continue after the original game, and the pieces that would allow it to do so were falling into place. There was just one problem. Monolith still couldn't use F.E.A.R's name. In order to get around this, the studio decided to launch a contest to let its American fan base name the sequel in mid-2007, promising to reward the authors of the 3 best submissions an all-expenses-paid trip to meet the development team in person, as well as having their names and likenesses featured in the game. One thing led to another, and Monolith's sequel became titled Project Origin. Both Monolith and its community were happy with the name, as well as the collaborative process that had led to its creation. But its lack of any sort of F.E.A.R branding was still unfortunate. While hardcore fans would know that Project Origin was a continuation of Monolith's 2005 opus, many casual players would not, and this would hurt its chances of success. Thus, it would come as a serendipitous surprise when, out of the blue in mid-2008, it was announced that Warner Brothers had managed to reacquire the rights to the F.E.A.R name from Vivendi, and that the sequel would now be retitled F.E.A.R 2 Project Origin. This had come about as a result of a series of happy coincidences. After finding the video game industry a little too volatile to weather on its own, Vivendi had decided to merge its game publishing unit with Activision in late 2007, resulting in the latter obtaining access to all the properties Vivendi owned and becoming Activision Blizzard in the process. However, upon the merger's completion the following year, the newly formed conglomerate quickly assessed that it had little use for most of these properties and decided to sell off the majority of them, leading to the F.E.A.R name finding its way back home. With the series now entirely back in its hands, Monolith would make a point of publicly delegitimizing Timegate's expansions, declaring them as having taken place in a non-canonical Vivendi timeline, while establishing F.E.A.R 2 as taking place in a Monolith timeline, the series' one true chronology. Although a fairly significant announcement looking from the outside, it meant very little for F.E.A.R 2's actual development, which by this point had resulted in a somewhat different feeling shooter than its predecessor. Some of this stemmed from changes many had naturally expected Monolith to implement in the sequel, such as attempting to further improve the intelligence of the game's enemies and making the game's environments more varied and colorful. But a lot more of it stemmed from some less expected changes, many of which Monolith would explain had been made as a result of the shifting landscape of entertainment media over the previous few years. The proliferation of the Saw films, for example, had led to the studio implementing more moments in the game in which the player would be confronted by short but intense bursts of horror. Likewise, the surge in popularity of first-person shooters on consoles had led to the game adopting many mechanics popular in them at this time, like the ability to aim down iron sights. Some of these changes would prove a little more controversial than others, such as the removal of being able to lean around corners. In a post on the game's community forums, Dave Matthews, F.E.A.R 2's primary art lead, would claim that this was purely done because the team felt its presence was hurting the game. From their perspective, the ability to lean allowed players to scan ahead of them risk-free and neuter their fight-or-flight mentality, making enemy encounters less tense. Its removal would force players to expose themselves more and be kept consistently on edge. But among the community, it seemed like a decision made more out of Monolith's desire to consoleize F.E.A.R 2. The final 12 months of the sequel's development would see almost all of Monolith's staff brought on to help ship it, making it one of the studio's largest projects yet. Unfortunately, when it would launch in February of 2009, the scope of its production wouldn't quite be matched in praise, with the consensus around F.E.A.R 2 Project Origin quickly becoming that it lacked the spark of its predecessor. Many agreed that its single-player campaign's escapades, which took place from the perspective of Delta Force operator Michael Beckett, following him on an ill-conceived quest to kill Alma, were much better paced than those of the original F.E.A.R, and still decently scary. One mid-game mission set in a dilapidated primary school called Wade Elementary would be especially praised in this regard, with players almost unanimously hailing it for its consistently unsettling atmosphere and intriguing environmental storytelling. And its multiplayer offerings, while not tremendously different from what had been offered in the past, were perfectly congenial. Yet the amount of scares it contained on the whole were paltry compared to what had come before it, and the rhythm of its firefights felt to beat off. While they still featured most of the unique mechanics, systems, and weapons introduced in F.E.A.R 1, such as the player's ability to slow down time, They tended to take place in more linear and restrictive arenas than normal, rarely allowing opposing parties to flank one another. This meant that both the player and the enemies they fought now had much fewer options than normal on how to engage each other, and that the latter group, as a result, seemed much less dynamic and intelligent than they actually were. Also unsatisfying, albeit for very different reasons, were the game's mechs. In order to both appease fans who wanted to wield power armor used by enemies in the first F.E.A.R. and spice up the game's flow, Monolith had made a point of including hulking mechs called Elite Powered Armor throughout F.E.A.R. 2's campaign for the player to intermittently control. While most found the mechs very fun to use, they simultaneously felt them to be at odds with the tone of the rest of the game, as if they had been ripped out of an entirely different project. To claim that F.E.A.R. 2 was a gigantic departure from the game that came before it would be unfair. Amidst its armored mechs, less numerous scares, and neutered enemy encounters, it still very much contained the soul of Monolith's first game. Yet fans couldn't help but wish it was a little more apparent.
On the ground and rolling out.
Copy that.
Like its predecessor, F.E.A.R. 2's single-player campaign would be followed by more story-centric content following its launch. Except this time, said content would come in the form of just one expansion, and it would be fully canonical. Titled F.E.A.R. 2 Reborn, the expansion would be promoted in the lead-up to its September 2009 release as containing bigger and more diverse environments than those featured in the game it was derived from, as well as much more engaging enemy encounters. The team at Monolith had been more than receptive towards people's complaints with their sequel, and wanted Reborn to both address and assuage them as much as possible, while also laying the groundwork for what would come next in the series. In the end, however, Reborn would miss its mark with most players. Its story, which followed a clone named Foxtrot 813 on a series of missions concurrent to the events of the base game, was decently entertaining for what it was, as were the many flashy set pieces 813 barreled through. The problem was that there just wasn't very much of any of it. At roughly 2 hours in length, most outlets agreed that Reborn was over far too fast for its own good. It contained glimpses here and there of the improvements that Monolith had promised it would contain, but because one blazed through it so quickly, it was difficult to stop and appreciate them. In retrospect, some players might have wished that they'd attempted to do so a little more, as F.E.A.R. 2 Reborn, without much fanfare, would end up being Monolith's last entry in the franchise. After repeatedly implying that it would be continuing the series itself after the expansion, the studio would instead use its release as an opportunity to pivot onto newer projects and pass on the series torch via Warner Brothers to a capable inheritor. Little did the world know that this inheritor had already been long chosen, and that it was planning on taking the series in some radical new directions.
Get up. I said get up.
Less than a year after the release of F.E.A.R. 2 Reborn, Warner Brothers would unveil F.E.A.R. 3, announcing that it would hit PCs and home consoles by the end of 2010, and that its development was being handled by none other than Vivendi's old flame, Day One Studios. In the interim following its work on the F.E.A.R. franchise for Vivendi, Day One had released 2008's Fracture, a third-person shooter in which one could raise and lower terrain through the use of futuristic weapons, and worked briefly on a pitch for a tie-in game for 2010's Tron Legacy that ultimately ended up being rejected by Disney. Fracture's development, which had been done in collaboration with LucasArts, had been an arduous process for Day One, and its review scores, which had ranged from middling to bad, reflected this. However, amidst these gaffes, the studio had also successfully negotiated with Warner Brothers to rework the version of F.E.A.R. 2 it was developing for Vivendi, which Warner Brothers had acquired the rights to at the same time it got F.E.A.R.'s name back, into a sequel to Project Origin. Thus, F.E.A.R. 3 was born. Despite the troubles it had endured over the previous few years, Day One would repeatedly express confidence in its ability to deliver a F.E.A.R. game worthy of the series' legacy in the lead-up to its release. In addition to its work on the first F.E.A.R.'s console ports, giving it greater insight than most on the series' inner workings, the studio had the blessing of Monolith on its side, as well as the support of comic book author Steve Niles and famed horror director John Carpenter. The two had both thoroughly enjoyed the series' first two entries in years prior, and after being asked by Day One to lend their expertise to F.E.A.R 3's development, graciously agreed to do so, with the studio recruiting Niles to help co-write the game's script and Carpenter to guide the direction of its cinematics. But Carpenter and Niles weren't just there to bolster Day One's sense of confidence or lend the project's marketing campaign an extra wrinkle. They were also there because Day One felt the duo would be most helpful in realizing a very specific dynamic the studio wanted F.E.A.R 3 to feature, one that the series' prior titles had never previously explored all that much, and spoke to both auteurs' experience in writing more intimate, familial scenarios. After F.E.A.R 2's flurry of new protagonists, Day One's staff had decided early on that their game would return to taking place from the Point Man's perspective, and realized in doing so that his relationship with Alma and Paxton Fettel was a source of untapped potential within the F.E.A.R universe, not just in terms of the narrative possibilities it could allow for, but also the new gameplay possibilities it could open up. In almost any kind of fiction, letting members of any dysfunctional family play off of each other nearly always yielded interesting situations, and the Point Man's family, as it were, was especially dysfunctional. For both this reason, as well as Day One wanting their game to reflect the increasingly social direction they felt that the medium of games was heading, F.E.A.R 3 would allow players to enjoy its entire campaign cooperatively as the Point Man and Fettel, who have formed an uneasy alliance to try and save both themselves and Alma from other supernatural forces. The latter had typically served a largely antagonistic role in the series, yet now she would also be at the mercy of being known as the Creep, and, as a result of F.E.A.R 2's conclusion, on the verge of giving birth to a third child. Day One's vision of how this cooperative experience would play out was ambitious, and unlike other examples within the genre. During gameplay, the Point Man would function as the series protagonist typically tended to, time-slowing abilities and all, while Fettel, now a specter bound to his brother's presence, would be able to manipulate enemies using his psychic powers, as well as temporarily possess them. Completing challenges strewn throughout the campaign would reward players with points that would rank up and improve both characters' abilities, and whichever player managed to earn more points than the other would result in the campaign's outcome being altered in their favor. Yet the studio would maintain that F.E.A.R 3 would still be perfectly enjoyable alone, espousing in interviews that it spent plenty of time making sure its campaign would be just as enjoyable as a single-player experience. Fettel's inherent creepiness would keep the game's atmosphere consistently tense, and a new generative scare system, which would monitor the way the game is being played, and use this data to determine when to surprise the player next, would prevent its frights from ever feeling predictable. Perhaps because of all these new systems and ideas, F.E.A.R 3 would end up taking much longer than initially promised to arrive, with multiple delays resulting in it eventually releasing in June of 2011. And when it finally arrived, it would do so to a much divided audience. Most tended to agree that even with its generative scare system, it rarely managed to feel frightful in and of itself, let alone like the games that had come before it. Where F.E.A.R 2 had felt as if it were at least partially cut from the same cloth as its mid-2000s predecessor, F.E.A.R 3, which now sported features like a Snap 2 cover system and regenerative health, felt largely divorced from its legacy. Its gameplay and overall tone influenced more by the bombast of the most popular shooters currently around it than by the subtle suspense of The Ring and Ju-On. There was little dispute that it was an action game first and a horror game second. But at the end of the day, many agreed that it was still an enjoyable and polished experience for what it was, one that only got better when played cooperatively. In addition to being fun to use, both Point Man and Fettel's varying abilities complemented each other extremely well, resulting in the game's campaign feeling much more distinct from other cooperative shooters, as well as immensely more replayable. And if the game's single-player offerings weren't to one's liking, there was also its multiplayer suite. Unlike Monolith, which had been content to populate F.E.A.R 1 and 2's multiplayer modes with fairly standard game types. Day One had taken it upon themselves during F.E.A.R 3's development to design a small, yet far more inventive set of competitive scenarios, and critics were more than impressed with the results. Between modes like Soul King, which pitted players against one another as soul-hungry phantoms, and Fucking Run, which forced players to hurry through enemy-strewn environments while being chased by a death-inducing mist, F.E.A.R 3's multiplayer was both a ton of fun and not quite like anything else on the market. It was easy to hate F.E.A.R 3 for what it represented, for being the culmination of a once unique feeling first-person shooter series decline into commonality during the 7th console generation. But it was impossible to hate F.E.A.R 3 on its own. Between the cooperative joys of its single-player campaign and the creativity of its multiplayer suite, Day One Shooter was more than another ho-hum experience when elevated on its own merits. Unfortunately, these positive attributes would fail to translate into sales. While F.E.A.R 3 wouldn't prove a massive commercial failure, it would fail to reach its predecessor's level of commercial success, putting the future of the series into question.
You know, the experience of building all of the games over the last 17, 18 years, like, you find things that work and you try to update them and replicate them. And so you'll see, you know, anybody who's played Monolith games will see little bits and pieces of like, oh yeah, that I remember something like that. You know, oh, that's really cool. Like, there's threads through it because it's the same folks working on it.
Yeah,
right?
it's a Monolith game. It'll taste like a Monolith game.
In the years following the release of F.E.A.R 3, all of the series' previous developers would find themselves thrust in radically different directions than before, with the whims of the video game industry altering their trajectories in ways both good and bad. Timegate Studios would endure the worst. After completing work on the science fiction theme shooters Section 8 and Section 8 Prejudice, the studio would go on to co-develop the critically maligned Aliens Colonial Marines alongside Gearbox Software before folding in May of 2013 due to financial difficulties. Day One Studios would be more fortunate. While it was forced to lay off the majority of its staff in late 2011 after an attempt to reboot Konami's Silent Scope series would fall through, it would end up being purchased by Wargaming in early 2013 after being enlisted to help the latter port World of Tanks to the Xbox 360. And Monolith Productions, after briefly dabbling in multiplayer-only titles like Gotham City Imposters, would manage to forge a new and much-beloved identity for itself with Middle-earth: Shadow of Mordor in 2014. A third-person action game set within J.R.R. Tolkien's mythic universe, Shadow of Mordor would draw considerable praise for its Nemesis system, a GOP-based artificial intelligence system that allowed enemy orcs who killed or survived an encounter with the player to obtain greater stature within their ranks and become much more powerful. Its inclusion provided the game with a healthy dose of unpredictability, and although it resulted in a very different gameplay experience than what the F.E.A.R games had provided, attested to Monolith's legacy of designing cutting-edge AI. Within the span of just a few years, every developer that had previously worked within F.E.A.R's confines had found itself unable or uninterested in returning to the series. Yet F.E.A.R would continue to prevail for a little while longer, with German video game publisher Area Games announcing in July of 2013 that PC gamers would soon be receiving F.E.A.R Online, a free-to-play, online-only rendition of the horror series composed solely of competitive and cooperative multiplayer modes. F.E.A.R Online had originally been announced in 2010 under the name F.E.A.R Origin Online and had previously only been slated to release in South Korea, not unlike how titles such as Call of Duty Online and Halo Online would later be developed exclusively for Chinese and Russian audiences respectively. While the fact that it would now be coming to the West was considerably surprising, reactions on the whole to F.E.A.R Online would be largely tepid. Some expressed cautious optimism, arguing that it could be just what the franchise needed to reinvigorate itself, as well as an enjoyable game on its own. After all, F.E.A.R Combat had also been a multiplayer-only affair, and it had maintained a dedicated fanbase for years after its release. Yet most struggled to care about it one way or another, After witnessing both F.E.A.R 2 and F.E.A.R 3 move further and further away from what had made their progenitor special, and then going 2 years without any new developments, F.E.A.R's fanbase had simply lost much of its passion for the series in general, let alone a freemium interpretation of it. And it didn't help that F.E.A.R Online's developer, a Korean studio named In-Play Interactive, had few other projects of note attached to its name. This miasma of apathy and mistrust would continue unabated when F.E.A.R Online would release in October of 2014 in open beta form. Despite being available for anyone to try free of charge, the game would struggle to attract much in the way of an audience, with what few players it did manage to woo finding it to be an unexceptional experience. Its few competitive modes, which consisted of standard multiplayer game types like Deathmatch, were fun and well-balanced affairs, and its microtransactions, which allowed one to purchase attributes like skins, support items, and crafting materials to fashion into new weapons, were nothing out of the ordinary for games in its genre. Yet its cooperative modes, which forced players to fight Alma-born monsters and soldiers alike in a series of increasingly challenging scenarios, was far too punitive, and in its entirety felt severely lacking in terms of polish when compared to the series' previous entries. F.E.A.R Online's graphics would be especially criticized in this regard, with many outlets expressing that they looked as if they were an entire generation behind. Given that the project had entered production roughly a half-decade prior, this observation was likely accurate. Even among its biggest proponents, it was hard to disagree that F.E.A.R Online felt like a F.E.A.R game in name only. Its visual and thematic connections to the trilogy that had come before it were fleeting, and the moments in which it actually felt like them were rarer still. Despite repeatedly expressing that they wanted to create an experience that F.E.A.R fans would be proud to play, Area Games and In-Play Interactive just didn't seem to have their heart in the project. So much so that they would provide it with almost no support after the beta's public release, and eventually shut it down less than a year later, in May of 2015. While the project's rapid death was of little surprise to the F.E.A.R community, it was still upsetting. F.E.A.R Online might not have been what most fans wanted, but it felt unfair that its producers had decided to hedge their bets so quickly and not make any attempt to further improve upon their work. And now that it was gone, F.E.A.R fans had nothing more to look forward to. The series had been on the rocks since the release of 3, yet F.E.A.R Online's end seemed to signal that it was finally, truly over.
Fall back into position. Fall down. Man down! Man down! We're taking heavy fire.
In May of 2018, nearly 3 years after F.E.A.R Online's closure, YouTube juggernaut Machinima announced out of the blue that it would be producing a live-action adaptation of the series for online distribution. No further details on the project were ever given, such as when it was expected to be completed, as well as whether it would be a single movie or an ongoing series. And unfortunately, none are likely to ever emerge in the future, as less than a year later, Machinima would abruptly shut down, taking down most of its programming on YouTube with it in the process. To most F.E.A.R fans, Machinima's live-action adaptation was a strange development, one that began and ended at the press conference announcing its existence. Yet the fact that it existed at all was still intriguing. There was no reason for Warner Brothers to have mandated its creation in the first place unless it felt that F.E.A.R still held substantial interest amongst gamers. And if that were the case, then a video game revival of the property might very well be in the cards. Either that, or Warner Brothers was just looking for a quick and easy way to prove it was still using the series license so that it could continue to hold on to it. Though even this would mean its owners still view it as having some value. What's known for certain is that even if such a revival were to happen, whichever studio would take charge of its development would have its work more than cut out for itself, especially if it tries to focus singularly on evoking the first game's feel. Titles like 2019's Resident Evil 2 have shown that there still exists a sizable audience for AAA caliber horror games today, meaning that it wouldn't be contentious for a hypothetical F.E.A.R 4 to focus more on evoking terror than the franchise's latter entries. But F.E.A.R, at its core, was never just a strong horror game. It was also an incredibly strong shooter, with immensely satisfying gunplay, and an intelligent cadre of enemies that put player stratagem to the test. F.E.A.R's next stewards would need to not only ensure that these two halves remain in balance, but do so while simultaneously updating the series for modern times. A feat that even Monolith itself struggled with, as evidenced by people's mixed reactions to their work on F.E.A.R 2. Yet, even if a fourth F.E.A.R game never comes to pass, the series' legacy is unquestionable. From the many other titles it influenced to employ elaborate artificial intelligence systems, meaningful time manipulation abilities, and environmental destruction physics, to the lessons it taught about combining different sources of inspiration to great effect. And it's that legacy that earned F.E.A.R the loyalty of its fans, and cemented the everlasting significance of its namesake in the history of gaming. Much like Alma herself, its spirit will continue to live on, no matter what happens to it.
What was that sound?
Our documentaries are crowdfunded and made possible by the generous supporters backing us on Patreon. If you enjoy our content, consider subscribing to our channel and becoming a patron to help us create more. Thank you.